My topic is the domestic Imperium. It's a big topic. And I'm going to talk about regulation. I thought I'd start with a couple of quotations from Hayek, and then I'm going to end with a couple of quotations from von Mises. I thought that would go over in a crowd like this. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek says, in the 1976 revised edition, they reprinted it in 1976, and he says that when he wrote the original version of The Road to Serfdom in 1944, socialism meant the nationalization of industry and central planning. But by the mid-1970s, socialism meant something different in the world. It meant essentially the institutions of the welfare state. It meant the transfer of income through the tax system, and it meant welfare. And I would add also it meant the regulatory state. He discussed that as well. And so what I'm going to talk about, I guess, what we usually use the phrase a lot around here, the welfare warfare state, but of course we live in the welfare warfare / regulatory state as well. And Lou, I agree with Lou that we're making great progress. There's light at the end of the tunnel somewhere. Most of you were here for Lou's talk last night. But we've got some major obstacles, and the major obstacles are the institutions and the individuals who benefit from the welfare, warfare, regulatory state. And of course, that's what the Mises Institute does day in and day out, is to debate and battle these individuals who want to maintain and expand the welfare, warfare, regulatory state. But yes, there's light at the end of the tunnel. I think there's hope. But at the same time, the state takes over 40% of all our income. And if you count the cost of regulation that pushes up the price of goods and services, that's a tax. It's over 50%. Every city in America is awash with bums, hoodlums, and criminals because of the welfare state. And there are over 10,000 commandments coming out of Washington nowadays in the form of regulation regarding even the shape of toilet seats. My friend Jim Bennett once told me, OSHA regulates the shape of toilet seats. And even I, as cynical about government as I am, I didn't believe it. Sure enough, he showed me the regulation that actually regulates the shape of toilet seats. I wonder, I can think of a good name for the person who thought that one up. But to look at an idea of the regulatory state, I thought I'd reproduce this graph here. Federal regulatory spending staffing is on the bottom, the number of regulatory bureaucrats, and on the top is spending on federal regulatory activity. And as you can see, despite all the talk about a conservative revolution and a Republican revolution and all that, both the staffing and spending on government regulation at the federal level have not abated at all. Have not been reduced at all, and they just continue to grow. And so, we continue spending about $15 billion a year on the federal bureaucrats in Washington, and several 100,000 of them are sort of are permanent pests who try to regulate every aspect of our life. And in addition to that, I looked up an interesting statistic. There are 500,000 elected and 13 million appointed local government, quote, officials to regulate everything from what color you can paint your fence to how much fertilizer you can put in your garden. And that comes out to one local government bureaucrat for every 20 citizens. So we are not in lacking in government regulators and people who want to control our lives. And what I thought I would talk about in terms of the regulatory Imperium is the MO, or the modus operandi, of the regulatory state in the context of really, I guess, a couple of books I've written. I've written a recent book called Cancer Scam. It's about the anti-smoking crusade, which I would argue is not really about smoking and health, but it's really about getting a hold of large amounts of money to fund an expansion of the welfare, warfare, regulatory state. And I'll explain to you why I believe that. And so I'm going to talk about, for a while now, what the elements are of this regulatory state and what it means for those of us who want to eradicate it. But first of all, I think it's very important to understand something else Hayek said in The Road to Serfdom, another quotation from Hayek. And he said, "The principle that the end justifies the means is an individualist ethics regarded as a denial of all morals. In collectivist ethics, however, it becomes necessarily the supreme rule. there is literally nothing which the consistent collectivist must not be prepared to do if it serves, quote, the good of the whole, because the, quote, good of the whole is to him the only criterion of what ought to be done. And we see this all the time of all the environmental lunatics, for example, who tell lie after lie after lie after lie about the environment. It really doesn't matter to them that people like us say, hey, this is not true. Look at all this data that says it's not true. To them, what matters is the strategy of convincing people, enough people, that they ought to accept their political agenda. They know they're lying. The ends justify the means to them. And I'm going to give you some examples of this in the context of what I think is the coming type of regulation, of additional regulation, in the form of what you might call the nanny state, what the British call the nanny state, which is really the massive regulation of lifestyles in the name of promoting public health, saving the planet, pick your grandiose cause. But I guess one example of this, recent example of this, is now that so many of us drive sport utility vehicles, that these are becoming a menace to society, and the EPA is about to crack down on them and trucks as well. But after having studied these characters, the anti-smoking crusaders, I've decided that, what are their motives? Motive number one, I think, is political plunder for fun and profit. Motive number two is central planning of politically correct lifestyles. And motive number three is to find a way to get money to finance careers as anti-capitalist crusaders, which most of the anti-smoking crusaders happen to be. Now, I'm not that big on smoking. I smoke a cigar every once in a while, but I never smoke cigarettes. I'm not saying we should all go out and smoke instead of smoking, but if you consider who the top anti-smoking regulatory zealots are, really, you have Michael Perchuk, former chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, who's a cigar smoker. And Perchuk runs something called the Advocacy Institute in Washington, which trains lobbyists to promote a bigger welfare state, more taxes, more regulation. And my book was reviewed in the New York Times about a month or two ago by another left-wing crank. We're not going to get anybody. And Lou called me up to congratulate me that it was trashed so severely, because if the New York Times trashes what we're doing, you know we're on the right track. But Michael Perchuk himself just could not help himself to write a letter to the editor to pile on to this. And he thought a real zinger that would really destroy all my credibility was, and they printed this, and he called me a libertarian tobacco propagandist. And to the left, there is nothing more evil, nothing in the world, than someone who believes in liberty and enjoys a good cigar every once in a while. That is the ultimate evil. And so he thought, all I need to do to destroy this guy's credibility is call him a libertarian tobacco propagandist, because all my friends in Washington will just immediately see that, and that'll be a signal that they should not take this guy seriously. And but Perchuk, another of the top gurus is a guy named Stanton Glantz, who teaches at the University of California, San Francisco. And he's a leading public health crusader, and he's such a darling of the left that they did a profile of him in People magazine last summer. And he's a big fat guy. And I thought, he's a public health advocate telling everybody don't smoke. You'd think he'd look healthy. I was expecting him to look healthy, but he looked terrible. His belly went over his belt, and why should I listen to this guy about healthy lifestyle? And the third top proponent for the past 20 years of the whole anti-smoking movement, someone who has introduced bills in Congress for 20 years running now to implement the political agenda of these characters, is Ted Kennedy. So the third top man in the lifestyle police is Ted Kennedy. So these are some of the reasons why I was originally suspicious of this whole anti-smoking thing. They're thinking public health is not really what these people are after. Got a cigar smoker, someone who looks like he's ready to die of a heart attack any moment, and Ted Kennedy being telling us how to live our lives in a more healthy manner. I wouldn't be too hard on Ted, though. He was the first Democrat to come out and defend Clinton because of the latest sex scandal. He offered to drive Monica Lewinsky home. So we shouldn't be too hard on him. Well, I'd like to just, in having studied how this crusade has commenced over the past number of years, which I think is going breakneck, for the regulation of beer, wine, liquor, fast food, and a lot of other things. They've already got a technique down that has succeeded, and they're about to extort tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars from the tobacco companies. I think they're going to try the same technique for other types of things that we consume in the name of public health. We eat too much of this. We drink too much of that. There's already a lawsuit in Washington State where a man is suing the dairy industry because of the argument that he has hardening of the arteries caused by drinking milk all his life. A Yale professor has proposed excise taxes on higher fat foods. The more fat content, the higher the excise taxes. And U.S. News, they even reported that they expect talk about an epidemic, public health epidemic striking the beer and wine industry next. Well, the first result of this, the ends justify the means, as Hayek said, with collectivists. The highest end is the greatest good for the greatest number. And so whatever the methods are, doesn't really matter that much. And the first result of this kind of belief with regard to the regulatory crusaders in the smoking movement, especially anti-smoking, is rampant lying. Just look at the keystone arguments that have been made. The one keystone argument is smokers are a financial burden on society. Well, common sense will lead you to question this by thinking, well, smokers pay heavy excise taxes all their lives. And it is true that a 30-year-old man who quits smoking is likely to live 7 or 8 years longer, which means if he doesn't quit smoking, he's going to die 7 or 8 years sooner. So the end result of the smoking habit is smokers are net subsidizers of the rest of us because in terms of, or not of us necessarily, but of the budget, the government budget, they pay heavier taxes than the rest of us do their whole lives, and they die earlier. So they don't get Social Security money, as much Social Security money and health care, Medicare spent on them when they die. And there have been very careful studies done of this by the RAND Corporation, Kip Viscusi at Harvard, the Congressional Research Service, even the New England Journal of Medicine last October published a study saying this. But this is the linchpin of the argument for getting the $365 billion settlement out of the tobacco companies, that the argument was an externality argument, that they impose externalities on the rest of us by raising our taxes. They get sick with heart disease and cancer, and they make us pay for it. Well, clearly, the evidence is that the opposite is true. The smokers actually subsidize the rest of us, but that doesn't matter because the ends justify the means. It was a trick, a gimmick used to get this passed, and it worked, to get many laws passed raising higher taxes on cigarettes and so forth. The second big lie in this case was the secondhand smoke scam. And the EPA took a look at 30 existing studies on the possible correlation between so-called secondhand smoke and cancer, the incidence of cancer. And 24 of 30 studies found no correlation at all. Only 2 found a statistically significant correlation. And this, of course, says nothing about causation. It's just correlation. And so what they did is they ignored the 24 studies and focused on the 6 that either said that there is a correlation or didn't really find. Some of the studies found a negative correlation. More exposure to secondhand smoke, the lower the incidence of cancer, which says something about the usefulness of these econometric techniques, I guess. And but anyway, so they did this, and they manipulated the data that was involved in those 6 studies so that they could come out and say that they have found a link between exposure to secondhand smoke and cancer. And as the old saying goes, if you torture the data long enough, it'll confess. That's what happened there. Bob Levy, a retired businessman who works at the Cato Institute now, he donates more money to the Cato Institute than what they pay him in salary. And so he's a real crusader. He's an ideological crusader. But anyway, I saw him on C-SPAN a few weeks ago, and he pointed out that someone got a hold of the same data that the EPA used on secondhand smoke and added one more variable, whether you're left-handed or right-handed. And they found a statistically significant positive correlation between being left-handed and getting cancer. All other things equal. Just to show that if you put enough variables in these equations, you could find a correlation with damn near anything. And that's apparently what happened. But again, the ends justify the means, so it doesn't matter that you've corrupted science. There was another, speaking of things that news media ignore, so we mentioned that this morning. There was an article in the New York Times about 6 months ago that the journalists made very little of it because most journalists know nothing about statistics or economics or most anything, I suppose. Most journalists. The article said the EPA, since it had had such a tough time establishing statistically significant correlations between ostensible causes of cancer like cellular phones and cancer, that they were going to do away with the use of statistical significance as their standard. I Xeroxed it. I gave it to all my colleagues. Can you believe this? And the news media just kind of ignored it. To me, I thought it was a huge deal that the EPA was finally admitting we're a bunch of con men, and here's the proof. We can't find statistically significant links between all these bogus cancer scares, so we're going to change the science. And so line number 3 with regard to the anti-smoking crowd is this was one study done by Stanton Glantz. And those of you who have read about the scientific method, what is the scientific method? Well, in theory, some theory is used to arrive at a hypothesis, and it is supposed to be a testable hypothesis, and in theory the results should be able to be reproduced by other researchers. And so typically what we're told is that if someone does one study saying that X causes Y, then if other people can replicate that study over time, then that may come to be accepted by the profession, whatever the profession is, as part of the learning of that profession. Well, the way in which the smoking regulators, the anti-smoking regulators have corrupted science, another way, is that government-funded studies of this sort include hundreds of thousands of dollars in the budgets for publicity. So you publish one study, just one, and you know the results are always going to come out the way the funding agency of government wants them to come out, and then you spend literally hundreds of thousands of dollars broadcasting the results of the study. Now that's not how the scientific method is supposed to work. It's supposed to be a slow process of repeated experimentation. That's not how it works. A great example of this is Stanton Glantz's one paper that claimed that if you ban smoking in restaurants, profits will go up. Profits will go up. Why didn't I think of that? Every restaurateur must have been thinking. I could be wallowing in cash if I would only ban smoking. And of course, he found this statistically significant correlation between restaurants with banned smoking altogether and profitability. Well, that study was used to ban smoking not only in all restaurants here in California, but in all bars. When Jeff Tucker and I were sitting in the bar last night, he asked if he could smoke, and they said, no, you have to go outside into the lobby to smoke. Usually, if you're in a hotel and you say, can I smoke? They say, no, you have to go in the bar. But now in California, they say, no, you have to go in the lobby to smoke. But this has been a catastrophe. The real-world experience has proven that this one study was a bunch of baloney, as common sense would indicate. There's such a riot here in California. A newspaper article on this that I cut out a couple weeks ago says 1 month after the nation's toughest law against indoor smoking took effect in California, a wave of civil disobedience is sweeping through the state's bars, taverns, and clubs, and people aren't enforcing it. And it talks about this one guy who in front of his patrons who were smoking, he feels obligated because of the law to go up to them and say, you do know smoking is illegal. And if they persist, he just gives them an ashtray, the article said. And that's clearly how it's working. And so common sense and experience tells us this was bogus. But this is one of the ways in which science has been perverted or politicized or corrupted in the pursuit of political correctness through regulation. Line number 4 is that the state must educate kids, tell them not to smoke, and it works. And it works to have the state educate kids and tell them not to smoke. There have been study after study of California, which has led the country with public school anti-smoking campaigns, that have found that the teenage smoking rate is at an all-time high in California, and it went up after they started spending millions of dollars having adults go into schools and preach to kids, don't smoke, don't smoke, don't smoke. Of course, that's the surest way to get kids to smoke, right? It's the forbidden fruit syndrome. And yet there's a lot of money to be made by the people who manage these programs. The people who cannot get a job doing anything else in the marketplace can get a career as an anti-smoking crusader by going into the schools and putting on these phony programs. In California, for example, here's what they get paid to do: holding outrageous stunt contests. The idea is to try to shock a loved one into quitting smoking. The winner of one contest was a young girl who ate an entire can of Mighty Dog dog food. There are trips to Yosemite. They give away backpacks. They give away lottery tickets. And they have pool parties, carnivals, and so forth. So it's just one big party, and the idea is to treat the kids real nice, buy them stuff, take them on trips, and then seduce them into not smoking that way. And no one ever checks whether this works. They tell the kids, if you promise not to smoke, we'll take you to Yosemite. That'll work. Yeah, that'll work. And of course, the kids are smarter than the regulatory zealots are, so they just take them for all they're worth and go to Yosemite and have a good time. And it hasn't worked, but there's a lot of money to be made. So the first result of this crusade has been rampant lying in the name of the higher cause, the collective cause. Another result is tax funding of politics. And I've written several books on this, on tax funded politics, beginning several years ago, whereby in California, for example, they passed a law in 1988 to raise tobacco taxes, but much of the revenue is earmarked to go to so-called nonprofit organizations that then use the money to lobby for even higher excise taxes and advertising bans and other restrictions and regulations. So the people who lobby for the higher taxes get the tax money come back to them. And so, which they use to lobby some more. And there are laws against it, but the governments just seem to just not pay attention to these laws against tax-funded politics. And that's even more insidious than just providing pork barrel jobs. In Massachusetts, for example, where they raised the tax in the name of public health on cigarettes, they provided a phone bank where you can call in and people will tell you, you really shouldn't smoke. And they'll tell you that it's a quit smoking phone bank. And they have 5 employees answering the phones and 8 supervisors. And the 8 supervisors make about $55,000 a year. And so what they're doing here really is just using tax dollars to pay the salaries of the American Cancer Society in Massachusetts division, and under the guise of this phony phone bank. And that really is all they do. And people can call in and they can try to persuade them to quit smoking. And the Centers for Disease Control, another egregious example of tax-funded politics in pursuit of regulatory purity, I suppose, is the Centers for Disease Control has spent millions of dollars training lobbyists to lobby for gun control laws, training them all the ins and outs of how to get gun control laws enacted, because the Centers for Disease Control has defined gun ownership as a disease. And their statutory obligation is to eradicate disease, right? So in other words, and I'm not making this up. I have all the documentation in my office. I have a grant document from the Centers of Disease Control to various groups. Someone who works for the Florida Department of Health sent it to me because they give grants to public health departments at the state level to lobby, to train lobbyists for things like that. And so that's an example of what I mean by tax-funded politics. This is something that Thomas Jefferson called sinful and tyrannical way back in 1786, compelling people to pay for political causes with which they disagree. The fourth result of the growth of the regulatory state that I see in my studies of the anti-smoking campaign, which I think is the future of the regulatory campaigns, is the politicization of charity. A lot of nonprofit organizations that used to be involved in providing assistance to individuals, charitable institutions, have essentially become arms of the state. One example I'll give you here is the American Lung Association. You may have heard recently that the EPA has proposed new clean air regulations to eradicate invisible soot particles that are so small they're hardly measurable. And this was done on the basis of a study done by some researchers who refused to make the data public. Some of you may be up on this. But anyway, it's going to be a new, more stringent regulatory regime in terms of clean air regulation. Now, the way in which this came about, the EPA administrator, Carol Bronner, has said, we had to do this. We were sued, and a judge told us we lost the lawsuit. We have to do this. It's not our fault. We didn't want to do this. Well, yeah, that's true. They were sued. They were sued by the American Lung Association, a grantee of the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA has given, in our book, we have this documented through Freedom of Information Act data that we acquired, that the EPA has given millions of dollars of grants to the EPA, so the EPA, or to the ALA rather, so the American Lung Association can sue the people who gave them the money for more stringent clean air regulation. So the American Lung Association, to a large extent, not totally, at the local level, they still do a lot of things educating kids about lung health and so forth. But the national organization has become essentially the Sierra Club. And the fifth result of this kind of crusade that I've seen and I've studied is the main goal here, as I said, is not so much public health, improving public health, but money. Money. To get money to finance careers as anti-capitalist activists, and money for causes that really have nothing to do with the ostensible reason for the higher taxes. For example, tobacco taxes have been raised state by state. The pending tobacco settlement that Congress is talking about at the moment, Clinton has proposed sending billions of dollars to the states for a daycare initiative. And I have a copy of here is something that a friend of mine sent me of something called the California Children and Families First Initiative. And this, I think, is the outline for what the Clintons have in mind when they say daycare and talk about daycare. It's being honchoed here in California by Rob Reiner, the comedian, the guy who used to play the role of Meathead on All in the Family, Rob Reiner. He's become the Clinton administration's unofficial spokesman on daycare policy, Meathead. But anyway, in the end, what the proposal is to increase tobacco taxes and to get federal money to finance government-run daycare from birth to age 5. Then when the kids are age 5, they go into the government-run schools for the rest of their lives. And so what this proposes is a set of regulations that would impose a uniform system of daycare providers that all have to comply with one system concocted by this California Children and Families First Commission. And they even say that one of their goals is to eliminate duplicative systems, which is another way of saying eliminate competition and freedom of choice. And so one of the other conclusions that I've come to in my research on all this is that the assault on tobacco is not just an assault on the tobacco industry. It's an attempt to get a hold of large amounts of money to expand the regulatory reach of governments in areas that have nothing to do with smoking. And that's why I think what's coming next are assaults on quite a few other industries. And I'll just give you a synopsis of what I mean here before I bring on the Mises quotes. And in these other industries, here's one other thing I need. It's time to wrap up, Lynn. Okay, one more minute. Okay, I have to put the von Mises quotes up here. On the other industries, I'll just mention that there have been groups like the Center for Science and the Public Interest that has waged campaigns against Chinese, Italian, and Mexican food. And their research technique is questionable, to say the least. They go to a restaurant, put 5 different dishes into a blender, and send it to a lab, and the lab comes back and says, boy, there's a lot of fat in that food. And they get huge headlines condemning that. And this sort of thing that I think is the reason why we're going to be seeing assaults on fast food, beer, liquor, wine next. Beer is going to be seen as a gateway drug to hard liquor and then to hard drugs. And they're going to make the argument that we better crack down on beer drinking. Now, so I'll conclude by quoting von Mises. Lou is getting anxious back there. As far as the significance of this crusade for politically correct consumption, for politically correct lifestyles, one of the things that von Mises said in Human Action is If it's true that the government derives its authority from God and is entrusted by providence to act as the guardian of the ignorant and stupid populace, then it is certainly its task to regiment every aspect of the subject's conduct. The God-sent ruler knows better what is good for his wards than they do themselves. It is his duty to guard them against the harm they would inflict upon themselves if left alone. Of course, he's saying that tongue-in-cheek. Everyone here would know. In the next page of human action, once the principle is admitted that it is the duty of government to protect the individual against his own foolishness, no serious objection can be advanced against any further encroachments. A good case could be made out in favor of the prohibition of alcohol and nicotine, and why limit the government's benevolent providence to the protection of an individual's body only? Is not the harm a man can inflict on his mind and soul even more disastrous than any bodily evils? Why not prevent him from reading bad books and seeing bad plays, from looking at bad paintings and statues, and from hearing bad music? The mischief done by bad ideologies surely is much more pernicious, both for the individual and for the whole society, than that done by narcotic drugs. No paternal government ever shrank from regimenting its subjects' minds, beliefs, and opinions. If one abolishes man's freedom to determine his own consumption, one takes all freedoms away. The naive advocates of government interference with consumption unwittingly support this case of censorship, inquisition, religious intolerance, and the persecution of dissenters. And that's quite a mouthful, but I think that's exactly what's going on, and that's why I've been writing a lot against the anti-tobacco crusaders and taking a lot of heat from them, because I think at heart they're crusading against human freedom.